She came to Harlan, Montana with a broken wagon axle, $43, and a reputation for reading timber the way other women read faces. Her name was Edith Crane, and she was 31 years old, and she had not planned to stop in Harlan at all. The plan had been to keep going north to the logging camps near Kalispell, where a foreman named Taggart had promised steady work for anyone who could scale timber and keep records straight. But the axle had snapped on the river road 7 miles south of town, and the mule had gone lame pulling the wagon out of the rut, and by the time she'd walked the rest of the way into Harlan with her pack on her back and her scaling rod across her shoulders, it was late afternoon, and the only thing she could afford to do was find somewhere cheap to sleep and figure out the rest in the morning. The livery owner told her about the Aldford mill the way people told you about a fire that had already happened. Not with urgency, but with the particular weariness of someone who'd watched something fail slowly and had run out of things to say about it. The Aldford operation, he said, had been the largest private timber holding in the valley 20 years ago. Old George Aldford had built it from nothing, cutting 3,000 acres of yellow pine on the South Ridge and milling it himself with equipment he'd brought up from Missoula by wagon. He'd kept records on everything, every tree he cut, every boardfoot he milled, every section of forest he left to grow back. People thought he was eccentric. He was the only timberman in the county who replanted anything. George had died 4 years ago. His son, Clement Aldford, had been running the operation since then, or failing to run it, depending on who you asked. Clement wasn't a bad man, the livery owner said. He just didn't have his father's eyes. Edith asked what that meant. The livery owner looked at her for a moment. George could walk into a stand of trees and tell you what was worth cutting, and what would be worth more in 10 years, and what was diseased and what looked healthy but wasn't. Clement walks into the same stand and sees lumber. He's been cutting at the wrong rate, taking too much from the fast sections, leaving the slow sections alone because they look thin. He's been burning through the inventory his father built without understanding what he was burning through. Edith was quiet for a moment. She knew what that looked like. She'd seen it at 2 other operations. "How much does he owe?" she asked. The livery owner looked at her like the question surprised him. "Enough," he said. She found the Aldford mill the next morning without asking directions. She could hear it from half a mile away, the sound of a single saw running, where there should have been 3, and she could see from the road that the log yard was down to maybe a quarter of what a full operation carried. The mill building itself was solid, stone foundation, good timber framing, roof that had been maintained. Whatever else had gone wrong, someone had taken care of the structure. A man was splitting wood beside the smaller outbuilding when she came through the gate, and he stopped and looked at her without any particular expression. He was somewhere around 40, lean through the face, with the kind of hands that had been doing hard work long enough that they'd stopped looking like hands and started looking like tools. She told him she was looking for Clement Aldford. "That's me," he said. She looked at the log yard, the single saw running inside, the stack of milled boards that was about half what it should have been for this time of year. Then she looked back at him. "I'm Edith Crane. I've been scaling timber and keeping mill records for 8 years in 3 different operations. I can read a forest the way your father could." She paused. "I heard you might need someone who can do that." He looked at her steadily. "Where did you hear that?" "The livery owner." She waited. "I'm not looking for charity work. I want fair wages and access to your father's records. All of them." His expression didn't change much, but something shifted in it. "Why the records?" "Because mills don't fail from bad timber. They fail for reasons that show up in the records before they show up in the log yard. I want to understand your reasons." He set down the splitting maul and looked at the mill building. The saw inside had stopped. A moment later, a man came out, older, wiping his hands on a rag, and looked at Edith without comment and went back inside. "That's Rafe," Clement said. "He's been here since my father's time. He keeps the saw running." He paused. "I can't offer much. 15 a month. Room in the office building. It's got a stove that works and a window that doesn't." She considered it. "I want access to everything, every record your father kept." He was quiet for a moment. "There are ledgers in the back office. My father kept them for 22 years. I'll be honest with you, Miss Crane. I've looked at them. I don't understand most of what's in them." "That's all right," she said. "I do." The back office was a room built onto the north side of the mill building, barely large enough for a desk, and the shelving that ran floor to ceiling on 2 walls. The shelving held ledgers. She counted them before she touched a single one. 47 volumes, going back to the year George Aldford had first filed a timber claim on the South Ridge. She started with the oldest one. It took her the better part of a week to understand what she was looking at, and the understanding came in pieces, not all at once. George Aldford had not simply kept records of what he cut and what he sold. He'd kept records of what grew back. Every section he harvested, he'd documented the replanting, the seedling survival rate, the growth measurements taken at 3-year intervals. He'd built a map, not on paper but in numbers, of a forest in continuous recovery. And he'd done something else. She found it on the 4th day, cross-referencing 2 ledgers from different years. He'd been marking certain sections with a notation she didn't recognize at first, a small triangle drawn in pencil beside the section numbers. She went back through the ledgers and found the mark repeated consistently over 15 years. She brought both ledgers to Clement at supper, which they ate at a table in the mill kitchen, because it was the largest room in the building and the only one with adequate light in the evenings. "Your father was tracking old growth recovery," she said. She opened the first ledger. These sections, the ones with the triangle marks. He wasn't cutting them. Clement looked at the ledger. He took his time with it, which she was learning was his way. He wasn't slow. He just didn't speak until he'd actually looked at something. "I knew he kept some sections off limits," he said. "I thought it was personal preference. Some people have an attachment to particular trees." She shook her head. "This is systematic." She showed him the growth measurements. He was tracking the old growth sections separately because they grow differently. Old growth timber has a different board quality than second growth, tighter grain, more consistent density, higher value per board foot. He opened the second ledger. These measurements go out 22 years. He was building something. What was he building? She looked at the table for a moment, thinking about how to say it plainly. "A reserve," she said. He was protecting the sections that would become the most valuable timber in the valley, and he was planning to cut them at a specific time. The measurements suggest he was thinking in 30-year cycles. Clement was quiet. The lamp between them moved slightly in a draft from the window. "How many sections?" he asked. She had counted them twice to be sure. 14, on the north face of the ridge mostly, where the moisture is better. She looked at him. "If your father's measurements are accurate, and they're meticulous enough that I think they are, those 14 sections contain timber that would sell for roughly twice the board foot price of what you've been cutting." He set down his fork. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Outside, the creek that ran along the east side of the mill yard moved steadily in the dark. "I've been cutting the wrong sections," he said finally. "You've been cutting what was visible and accessible." She said it without judgment because it wasn't a condemnation. It was just what had happened. "The sections your father marked are on steeper ground. They'd require more equipment to access. From the road, they don't look like much." He pushed back slightly from the table. His face did something careful and controlled, the way faces do when the thing underneath is too much to let out directly. "My father never said anything about this," he said. "He kept records for 22 years and never said anything." She didn't respond to that directly. She'd learned in the first few days that Clement processed things in silence, and filling that silence didn't help. The next morning she was up before first light, and she took the old growth maps she'd reconstructed from the ledgers and walked the North Ridge. She wore her heaviest boots and carried her scaling rod, and she spent 6 hours walking terrain that hadn't been worked in 20 years. What she found was not what she'd expected, which was to say it was better. Old growth yellow pine at this elevation, in this moisture band, with 20 years of undisturbed recovery behind it, was something she'd seen only twice before in her working life. The canopy was dense and high, and the undergrowth was the kind that came with true old growth, fern and young hemlock, and a ground cover of needles so thick it muffled her steps. The trees themselves were not large by Eastern standards, but they were consistent, and their grain, when she checked the cores with the small borer she carried, was as tight as she'd hoped. She made her measurements. She wrote them down carefully. She walked back to the mill in the late afternoon with the numbers in her notebook, and a feeling she generally found uncomfortable because it usually preceded disappointment. The feeling was something close to certainty. She found Clement in the log yard. He was examining the equipment they'd need to access the North Ridge sections. Not at her request, she hadn't told him what she'd found yet, but apparently on his own initiative. "How bad is the road up there?" she asked. He looked up. "Bad enough. We'd need to build about a quarter-mile of access road and reinforce 2 creek crossings." He paused. "I priced the lumber for it this morning." She looked at him. "And?" He named a number. It was significant. Not impossible, but significant. She told him what she'd found on the ridge. He listened the way he always listened, without interruption and without visible reaction, except for one small moment when she told him the grain measurements, where something moved briefly across his face and was gone. He was quiet for a while after she finished. "How sure are you?" he asked. "I've been measuring timber for 8 years. I'm sure of the measurements." She paused. "What the measurements mean for price depends on the market." "What's the market?" She'd been watching the prices in the weekly paper since she arrived. The railroad expansion through the northern part of the state was creating demand for tight-grain structural timber that the usual second-growth operations couldn't fully meet. There were 3 contracts in the region currently unfilled. She'd checked. She'd checked because it was the kind of thing she checked. "Good," she said. "Better than it's been in 3 years." He picked up a piece of wood from the ground beside the equipment and turned it in his hands. It was a habit she'd noticed before. He needed something to do with his hands when he was thinking. "How long to build the access road?" he asked. "If we hire 2 men and start next week, 6 weeks, maybe 7, and how much timber in those 14 sections?" She gave him the estimate. She watched him do the arithmetic. She'd already done it herself. "At current prices," he said, He stopped. "That's enough to clear the debt and run the operation for 3 years without touching another section," she said. He set the piece of wood down carefully. The afternoon light was going flat in the way it did in October, the sky pressing down gray and even. "Who else knows about these sections?" he asked. "Nobody who's looked at your father's records." She paused. "But the sections are visible from the county road if you know what you're looking for." He looked at her. "Do the men at the county office know what they're looking for?" That was the question she'd been thinking about. "There's a man named Ward Pullman," she said. Clement went still in a particular way. "You know him." He was quiet. "I know of him. He's been trying to buy timber rights in this valley for 2 years. He's had the county assessor out to 3 operations in the past year. The assessors have found reasons to lower the valuations on all 3 of them." She hadn't known that specifically, but she'd heard the general outline of it from Rafe, who didn't talk much, but talked about the right things when he did. Pullman had money from somewhere back east, and a very specific interest in Montana yellow pine, and a way of approaching struggling operations that left a smell on things, even when you couldn't point to what exactly he'd done. "What's his interest in the county office?" she asked. "His brother-in-law sits on the county commission," Clement said. He looked at the log yard. "My father had a dispute with Pullman once. Before I came back to run the mill, my father won. He didn't say how. She thought about that. A man with commission connections and a pattern of engineering low valuations on struggling properties. A mill that was struggling in ways that were visible and documentable. Old growth timber that nobody knew was there except her and Clement and the ledgers in the back office. If Pullman knows about the North Ridge sections," she said, "or suspects. He'd move to acquire while the valuation is low," Clement said, "before any sale could reflect what's actually there." She looked at the log yard, at the single saw running inside the mill, at the stack of boards that represented what the operation had left to work with. "Does your debt note sit with the county bank?" she asked. "Harlan Merchant, man named Goss. Does Goss have any connection to Pullman?" He was quiet for a moment that told her the answer before he said it. "Pullman's company keeps its operating accounts there." She took that in. "How long until the note is due?" 7 months, end of April. "And your current projection?" He looked at her directly. "Honest. If I sell everything ready for market by spring, maybe 2/3 of what I owe." She did the arithmetic. "You're going to come up short by around $800. He nodded once. "Don't sell anything yet," she said it quietly. "Give me 3 weeks to understand what's actually on this property. Then we'll talk about what to do next." He looked at her for a long time. A woman who'd been at his mill for 8 days was asking him to hold off on the decisions he'd been building toward for months. The reasonable response was to tell her she didn't understand the situation. He'd watched her walk 6 hours of hard ridge terrain alone, and come back with measurements accurate enough to cross-reference against 22 years of his father's records, and find no significant variance. 3 weeks, he said. She walked every acre of accessible timberland in those 3 weeks, and she came back with a picture that was worse in some places, and considerably better in others than either of them had understood. The second growth sections nearest the mill had been overcut in the 2 years following George's death, Clement cutting faster than the growth rate could support. That damage was real, and it would take years to fix. But the North Ridge sections were intact, and the eastern plateau that George had begun replanting in the 1880s was 20 years into recovery and producing timber that was not old-growth quality, but was meaningfully better than the overcut sections. She put it all on paper, sitting in the back office every evening after supper, building a picture of the operation that had not existed before, because nobody had looked at all the pieces at once. On the 18th day, she came to find Clement in the mill. He was helping Rafe with a blade replacement, which he'd been doing more of lately, she'd noticed. Small things around the operation that he hadn't done before she arrived. "I'm ready to tell you what I think," she said. He finished with the blade and washed his hands and came to the office. She'd pinned 3 hand-drawn maps to the wall above the desk, the North Ridge, the Eastern Plateau, and the overcut sections, each one marked with measurements and notations in her careful hand. She stood in front of them the way she'd learned to stand when she needed to be taken seriously, straight and still, and facing him directly. "You can't cut your way out of this debt," she said. "Not on the sections that are currently accessible, not without damaging the operation beyond what it can recover from in 5 years. She pointed to the overcut map. "You're already close to that line. You need to let those sections rest." He was looking at the maps and not at her. She let him look. "What you have," she continued, "is a reserve that nobody knows about and a replanting program that's 20 years into paying off." She pointed to the North Ridge. "These sections, if you can build the access road and get equipment up there, will produce enough to clear your debt and sustain the operation for a significant time. But you can't do it fast enough alone." "Why not?" "Because the road takes 6 weeks and you have 7 months, and the operation still has to run while the road is being built. You need capital, you don't have to hire the extra men." She turned to the third map. "So that leaves the Eastern Plateau. This timber is ready to thin. It's not the premium product the North Ridge will eventually yield, but it's sellable at standard prices, and thinning it now will accelerate the growth of the remaining stand." She looked at him. "If we contract a controlled harvest on the plateau sections and use that income to fund the road construction, we can have the North Ridge sections accessible before the debt is due." He was quiet, looking at the maps. "And there's one more thing," she said. "The access road for the North Ridge also crosses the southeastern boundary of your property before it turns north. There's a logging contractor named Vickers. Rafe told me about him. He's been trying to find a reliable route to some state timber sections on the far side of the ridge for 3 years. Your new road would give him access." He looked at her. "You want to sell road access. I want to lease it. Per season. Vickers gets a route he can't get elsewhere. You get recurring income that has nothing to do with cutting your own timber." She paused. "And it gives you a second layer of documentation that the road serves multiple legitimate purposes, which matters if anyone tries to challenge the construction permit." He sat down. He put his hands on the desk. He looked at the 3 maps for a long time without speaking. "If the timber assessment comes back lower than your measurements," he said, "my measurements are defensible. I have the core samples, and I have your father's records as a 22-year baseline." She looked at him. "No honest assessor is going to look at this documentation and call these sections standard second growth." He looked up at her. "And if the assessor isn't honest?" She didn't answer that immediately. She'd been thinking about it for days. "Then we're dealing with something worse than bad luck. But we deal with it the same way, with documentation thorough enough that the alternative to accepting it is a legal challenge that Pullman won't want to be named in." He looked at the maps again. He looked at them for a long time. "All right," he said. "Start with the plateau thinning." The thinning contract took 2 weeks to negotiate with a buyer in Missoula, who came up by train to look at the sections before he committed. He was a deliberate man named Torrance, who examined the timber with the focus of someone spending real money and asked questions that told her he actually knew what he was looking at. She answered every question with documentation. Torrance took the core samples back to Missoula and sent word by letter 10 days later. He'd take the full plateau contract at the price she'd quoted. Clement read the letter at the kitchen table and set it down. That covers the road construction, he said, and wages for 2 extra men through February, she said. Rafe already knows someone. A man named Sheehan, who used to work the northern camps. He's reliable. How do you know that? She'd asked Rafe the same way she asked Rafe everything, which was directly and without explanation of why she wanted to know. Rafe answered the same way he answered everything, which was accurately and without decoration. Rafe was the most useful person she'd encountered in her working life, and she'd told him so, which he'd received with the exact same expression he received everything, which was no particular expression at all. The road work started in November, which was not the ideal season, but was the season they had. The ground froze hard in the 3rd week, and they lost 5 days, and the second creek crossing turned out to require twice the reinforcement Clement had estimated, which cost money they hadn't planned for. She told him the number, and he looked at it and didn't say anything dramatic about it, and they found the money by adjusting the timeline on the plateau harvest. She was wrong about things during those months. She'd estimated the plateau timber at a yield that turned out to be 6% low, which in the scale of the contract was meaningful. She'd told Torrance to expect a completion date that they missed by 11 days, because the second creek crossing took longer than expected. Torrance was not happy about the 11 days, and she called on him in Missoula to say so directly, without excuses, and to give him a revised timeline that she was confident in. He looked at her across the desk in his Missoula office. "You're not what I expected from a Harlan mill," he said. She didn't ask what he'd expected. She gave him the revised timeline and came back to Harlan, and told Clement they'd had a difficult conversation and that it was fine. He'd been worried while she was gone. She could tell, not from anything he said, but from the way he was standing in the log yard when she came back, which was the way he stood when he was waiting for something he didn't want to wait for. "Torrance will honor the contract," she said. "You're sure?" "He's a man who makes decisions on evidence. I gave him evidence." She tied her horse to the post. "He's not happy about the 11 days. He shouldn't be, but he'll honor it." Clement was quiet. Then, without looking at her, "What did you tell him?" "The truth, that we had a problem, what the problem was, how we'd fixed it, and when it would be done." She looked at him. "I find the truth is usually the most useful thing to say to someone you're going to need to trust you again." He was quiet for a moment. "My father used to say that," he said. Not in those words, but the same idea. She didn't respond to that. She untied her pack from the saddle and went inside. Ward Pullman came to the mill on a Thursday in December. He arrived in a good wagon with a matched team, which told her something, and he came alone, which told her something else. He was 50 years old, or thereabouts, with a face that had learned to look reasonable regardless of what it was actually doing. He shook Clement's hand in the yard and looked around the operation with eyes that were pricing things. She knew those eyes. She'd seen them on 2 other men in 2 other valleys, and both times, the mills they'd visited had been sold within a year. "Miss Crane," he said when Clement introduced her. "Manager. Operations," she said. He smiled at that in a way that had nothing to do with warmth. "I didn't know Clement had brought in outside help." "Recent addition," Clement said. His voice had gone flat in a way she was learning to read. Pullman looked at the log yard, at the reduced stack of boards, at the single saw running. "I've always had a regard for this operation," he said. "George built something real here. It's a shame about the difficulties." He looked at Clement. "I wanted you to know that my offer stands. If you find yourself needing to simplify, I'm in a position to make a fair arrangement." Clement said he wasn't looking to sell. "Nobody ever is," Pullman said pleasantly, "until they are." He glanced toward the back office, toward the window of the room where the ledgers were kept. He couldn't have seen anything through it, but the glance was deliberate. "I just want you to know the door is open." After Pullman left, Edith found Clement at the creek crossing on the east side of the yard. He was standing, looking at the water. "He knows," she said. "He suspects something," Clement said. "He doesn't know what." "He looked at the office window on his way out," she said. "He knows we've been in the records." Clement was quiet. "He comes from timber money. He knows what careful records might mean for an operation that looks like it's dying." He paused. "He'll want to know what's in them." She thought about the ledgers. 47 volumes in that back office. 22 years of George Aldford's careful notation. Does Pullman have anyone inside the county assessor's office? She asked. Clement picked up a stone and turned it in his hand. The county assessor's brother-in-law manages the timber licensing division for the Eastern District. His name is Cogswell. He looked at the creek. My father had a dispute with Cogswell once, too, before my time. I heard about it secondhand. I don't know the details. She looked at the water. The creek was running low for December, which meant a dry winter, which had implications for the spring road conditions she filed away without thinking about it. What happened to your father's dispute with Pullman? She asked. He won it. Clement said it simply. He had better lawyers and better records, and he won it. He dropped the stone into the creek. He never explained to me how. She was quiet. The better records, she thought, were in the back office, behind 47 ledgers. She was almost certain of that now. The lease arrangement with Vickers was finalized in January. She'd ridden out to his operation herself, in weather that had no business being what it was for a day's ride, and she'd laid out the proposal in the same way she laid out everything. Plainly, with numbers, without apology. Vickers was a compact, weathered man who ran his operation out of a converted homestead cabin 2 ridges over. He listened to her proposal without interrupting, and then asked 3 questions that showed he understood exactly what she was offering, and what it would cost him, and what it would save him. He said yes. On the ride back, she thought about the road. It was half finished. Sheehan's crew had made it through the worst section, and the grade was coming down to something manageable. In another 6 weeks, if the weather held, they could get equipment up to the North Ridge. She thought about what was waiting up there. She'd walked it twice since that first time, measuring again, checking again. The timber was what she'd said it was. She was as certain of that as she was of anything. The problem that arrived in February was the one she'd been bracing for. A letter came from Harlan Merchant Bank, not from Goss himself, but from the bank's official heading, in formal typed language. It cited a clause in the loan agreement and requested an assessment of the property's timber assets and mill value to be completed before the end of March, at which time the bank reserved the right to adjust repayment terms. Clement read it at the kitchen table. He set it down with the particular care of someone who knows that putting something down roughly won't help. Pullman, he said. Almost certainly. She sat across from him. What do you know about Goss? He's been at the bank 12 years. He's careful. He's not corrupt in the obvious way. He looked at the letter. But he's not independent either. He knows where the money in this valley comes from. She thought about the timing. December to February. Pullman had come to the mill in December. The letter had arrived in February. That was not coincidence. We need a lawyer, she said. Someone from outside Harlan County. Do you know anyone? He thought about it. My father used a man in Helena when he had the dispute with Pullman. Name was Carver. I don't know if he's still practicing. Find out. She was already thinking through the other things. And I'm going to put together a formal documentation package for the timber assets. Everything. Your father's records, my measurements, the core samples, the Torrance contract, the Vickers lease. All of it organized so that any assessor who walks onto this property has to contend with 22 years of baseline data before they say a word about current value. Can we require them to take it into consideration? We can submit it formally before the assessment happens. She looked at him. An assessor who ignores 22 years of systematic records in order to reach a convenient valuations is creating a paper trail that a judge would find very interesting. He looked at the letter again. There was something in his face that was working through several things at once. How much of this did you anticipate? He asked. The bank assessment? All of it. Pullman, the timing, the connection to the county office. She was quiet for a moment. I recognize the pattern, she said. I've seen it before in other valleys. Not exactly this, but enough that I knew what questions to ask. He looked at her. You didn't say anything. I didn't have anything to say that would have changed what we were doing. She looked at the letter. We were doing the right things. That hasn't changed. He was quiet for a long time. Then, without looking up from the table, my father used to walk the ridge every evening, after supper, whatever the weather. I never knew why. I thought it was just habit. He looked toward the window, toward the direction of the North Ridge. Now I think he was reading it. The documentation package she built over the next 2 weeks was 31 pages in her careful hand. It covered the timber inventory in 4 categories: the North Ridge, the Eastern Plateau, the recovering overcut sections, and the mill infrastructure. It included the core sample data, the growth rate calculations, the 22 years of George's notations cross-referenced against her own measurements. It included the Torrance contract and the Vickers lease as evidence of third-party validation of the timber value. She wrote a section on the road construction that was half-finished on the North Ridge, including the projected completion date and the projected access it would provide. She wrote it as an argument, not a report. She'd done it before, for a different kind of claim in a different state, and she knew the difference. Clement read it over 2 evenings. When he'd finished, he set it on the desk between them. "You've done this before," he said. She looked at the pages. "Before Montana, I spent a year doing documentation work for a land claims office in Wyoming. People would come in with their properties, their records, their histories. We built arguments for why the asset value was what they said it was." She paused. Some of them lost anyway because the other side had more money. What happened to those ones? They lost their land, or their operation, or their independence. She looked at the table. The ones who had good documentation had a fighting chance. He was quiet for a moment. And the ones who didn't, they had no chance at all. She picked up the pages and tapped them even. That's why this exists. The man in Helena turned out to be retired, but his former partner was practicing, a woman named Taggart, who had learned land law from the same source, and apparently improved on the original considerably. She came to Harlan by train in the first week of March, a brisk, organized woman of about 45, who read the 31-page documentation package on the train and arrived at the mill with a set of questions that told Edith she'd read it properly. Taggart looked at everything. She walked the finished section of the North Ridge Road. She examined the mill. She spent 2 hours in the back office with the ledgers. She drank coffee at the kitchen table and asked Clement about the history of the Pullman dispute with his father. "Do you have the records from your father's dispute?" she asked. Clement said he didn't know if they still existed. "Find them," Taggart said. If he was thorough enough to keep 22 years of timber records, he probably kept those too. They spent a full day looking. The records were in a locked box in the bottom drawer of the back office desk, which neither of them had thought to open because it was locked, and neither of them had a key. Rafe, when asked, said he'd seen George open it once a long time ago, with a key he kept on the same ring as the mill keys. The mill key ring was on a hook by the main door. There were 11 keys on it. The 8th one opened the box. Inside was a file of correspondence, 11 years old, between George Altford and the same lawyer in Helena. It was not about timber. It was about a water rights claim on the creek that ran along the east side of the mill yard. Pullman had filed for diversion rights that would have significantly reduced the creek's flow through the mill property. George had contested it and won, on the basis that the creek was integral to mill operations, and that Pullman's claimed need for diversion was not supported by any documented agricultural or industrial use. Taggart read the file twice. She looked at Edith. "He kept meticulous records of the dispute," she said. "He kept meticulous records of everything," Edith said. "This changes the picture." Taggart set the file on the table. Pullman lost a legal contest to this property once before. He's been patient. If this assessment goes his way, he gets what he wanted and can claim it was legitimate. She looked at Clement. "We need to file 2 things immediately. A formal submission of the documentation package to the county assessor's office before the assessment happens, and a notice of prior legal contest with the state land office." "What does the second one do?" Clement asked. "It creates a record that Pullman has a documented history of conflict of interest with this property. It doesn't stop the assessment, but it means that any subsequent legal challenge we bring has context." She paused. "It also means Pullman knows we know. Sometimes that's enough to change his calculation." She filed both documents in Helena by end of that week. On the Saturday before the assessment, Ward Pullman sent a note. He brought it himself this time, riding out alone in the morning without the matched team, and he handed it to Clement in the yard. It was not a formal offer. It was Pullman's own handwriting on a single folded page. It said he was prepared to significantly improve his offer, and that a conversation might be in both their interests before the situation became complicated. Clement read it and handed it to Edith. She read it. "He's rattled," she said. "Pullman doesn't rattle easily. He came himself instead of sending a lawyer. That's rattled." She folded the note. "He knows we've filed in Helena. He knows the documentation exists. The easy version of this, for him, just got harder." Clement took the note back. He folded it smaller. "What do we tell him?" "Tell him you've received his note, and will respond through counsel. She looked at the gate, where Pullman had gone. The road was empty now, and the morning was cold and clear, and the north ridge was visible above the tree line, the access road cutting a pale line through the timber. The assessor arrived on a Wednesday. His name was Burnell. He'd come from the state capital, which Taggart had arranged through a contact she hadn't explained, and he had the manner of a man who'd been doing technical assessments long enough that he'd stopped having opinions about what he found. He spent 2 days. He walked the North Ridge Road. He examined the mill. He spent most of the first afternoon in the back office, with the ledgers and the documentation package. He asked Edith technical questions about the core samples that told her he understood what he was looking at. On the second evening, sitting at the kitchen table, he set his notebook down and looked at the documentation package, and then at Edith. "The documentation here is unlike anything I've reviewed in a property assessment," he said. "Your father kept careful records," Edith told Clement beside her. Burnell looked at the notebook, the timber on the North Ridge, as measured and documented. He paused. "I've been told this operation was in material decline." He looked up. "That is not what I see in the records or in the field." He left the next morning. They stood at the gate and watched his wagon go. Clement was quiet. When the wagon was out of sight, he exhaled slowly in the cold air. He saw what was there, Edith said. "It doesn't mean the bank will accept the assessment. No, but an honest assessment changes the legal exposure if they try to push forward on early collection." She turned toward the mill. She was cold, and she hadn't slept well, and there was still work to do. "We've changed the shape of the problem." "What's the shape now?" She thought about it. It used to be shaped like a collapse that had already started. Now it's shaped like a hard season with a specific endpoint. She looked at him. Those are different things. The word from Taggart came in the second week of April. A short letter in a precise hand. Assessment filed with state office. Bank declined to exercise early collection clause. Original terms stand. Note due as scheduled. Clement read it at the kitchen table. He set it down. "They're not calling the note." "No." She looked at the stove. Her hands were not entirely steady, which annoyed her. She'd been steady through 4 months of building and defending and fighting, and it was the relief that made her hands shake, which was perverse. "We still owe the full amount by end of month," she said. "I know." He looked at the letter. The plateau harvest cleared enough to fund the road and cover operating costs. "The road is done in 2 weeks. The North Ridge timber," she said. "Torrance wants to expand his contract. He's been asking since February, I know." He reached into his coat pocket and set another letter on the table. "That came yesterday. I was waiting to see what Taggart sent first." She looked at the Torrance letter. He was offering a purchase price on the first North Ridge section that was higher than her conservative estimate and just below her optimistic one. It was enough to clear the debt with a remainder. She looked at the table for a moment. "Take it," she said. He was already going to, she could tell. He hadn't taken it yet because he'd wanted to see the bank letter first, to make sure the ground was solid before he committed. The contract was signed with Torrance in the last week of April, and the debt was paid to Harlan Merchant Bank on the 28th of that month. Clement went to the bank himself and paid Goss in the office, and came back without saying much about the conversation, except that it had been brief. Goss said, "Thank you," Clement said. "The particular kind of thank you that means something's over." "Yes," Edith said. He looked at the log yard. The North Ridge Road was finished, and equipment had been up there twice now, and the sections were being marked for the harvest that would start in May. The mill was running 3 saws again. Rafe had taken on 2 more men, younger, and was teaching them the equipment the way he'd apparently taught Clement, which was by demonstrating once and expecting them to have paid attention. "Things are moving differently," Clement said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He had a piece of millwood in his hand, which she'd stopped noticing weeks ago because he always had something in his hands when he was thinking. He turned it over. "The vicar's lease renewal is due in June," he said. "I want your name on it." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because you built it," he said. "And I want that in the paperwork." He set the wood down. "My father built things that weren't in the paperwork, and it cost us." She didn't answer that immediately. "I'm not my father," he said. "I know that. He built this from nothing, and he held it for 22 years, and he knew things about this land that I still don't fully know. But I've been learning." He looked at the ridge. "I know why he walked up there every evening now. I didn't before." She looked at the North Ridge. The pale cut of the access road was just visible above the tree line, catching the morning light. "He left it for you to find," she said. "He couldn't find the words for it." She paused. Some people build things they can't explain. The record was the explanation. Clement was quiet. Then, simply, "I'd like to make this a formal arrangement, not wages. A stake in the operation. 20% now, with an option to renegotiate in 3 years depending on what the breeding program produces." She looked at him sideways. "The timber program," he said. "I'm not a man who says things wrong on purpose." She looked at the mill, at the 3 saws running, at Rafe walking across the yard with the same expression he walked everywhere with, which was the expression of a man entirely indifferent to drama. "Ask me again when the Torrance contract is fully settled," she said. "I don't make arrangements in the middle of things." He nodded. "That's not a no." "It's not a no," she said. He went back to work. She went back to work. The spring came on in the way it did at this elevation, slowly and without ceremony, the snow retreating up the slopes and the creek running higher, and the timber on the north ridge standing the way it had stood for 30 years, patient and dense, and waiting for someone with the right eyes to finally understand what was there. Burnell's assessment report was filed in the state records and sat in an office in Helena, patient and official, next to a box of prior legal correspondence between a dead man and a retired lawyer. And between them, the 2 documents told a story about something that had almost been lost and hadn't been. Not because luck had been particularly generous, but because someone had written things down carefully enough that another person, arriving at exactly the right moment with the right ability to read what had been written, had been able to find them. The note on the vicar's lease renewal, when it was signed in June, had 2 names on it. Ward Pullman made one more attempt in the fall, through a different channel, approaching the county commission about a road widening project that would have required an easement through the eastern edge of the mill property. Taggart handled it. The attempt failed in less than a week. After that, Pullman's interest in the Aldford operation appeared to shift elsewhere, and within 2 years it was generally understood in the valley that he had turned his attention to operations in the Bitterroot, where the record-keeping was less thorough and the owners less prepared. The breeding program, Edith would say later to anyone who asked, though she never said it quite that way out loud, was the timber program. What George had started and Clement had nearly lost, and she had found in 47 ledgers and translated into something the world could act on. What came from that was not dramatic, not in the way people expected success to be dramatic. The North Ridge produced 3 seasons of harvest before it was rested. The Eastern Plateau reached full maturity in the 8th year and produced timber that Torrance, by then an old acquaintance, said was the finest structural pine he'd purchased in 20 years. The mill ran on 3 saws, then 4. Rafe died in the 5th year. He died in the mill, which was where he would have wanted to die if he'd been the kind of man to have preferences about it, and they buried him on the hill above the creek. And Clement spoke at the graveside without notes, in a voice that was steady and brief, and Edith stood nearby and didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to add. Clement walked the ridge every evening after supper from that first fall onward. She saw him doing it from the mill sometimes, the figure of him moving along the tree line in the fading light, and she understood what he was doing without needing to say so. What George had known and passed on imperfectly, Clement was learning in full. Not from being told. From paying attention, from looking at the same ground every day until the ground told him what it knew. That was how it worked, and it was slow, and it had no shortcut. In the 10th year, a man from a timber association came to write an account of the Aldford operation for a trade publication. He spent 3 days asking questions and looking at things, and at the end of the last day, he asked Edith the question she'd been expecting since the first day. "When you arrived here," he said, with the particular enthusiasm of someone who believed in clean origin stories, "did you know what you were going to find?" She looked at the North Ridge, green and full above the tree line. "I knew there was something to find," she said. "I didn't know if we'd find it in time. Those are different questions." He wrote that down. "What made you stay?" he asked. She thought about the honest answer, which was the only kind she kept. "I don't make decisions to stay," she said. "I make decisions to keep working on the problem in front of me." This one turned out to be worth it. The man wrote that down too, and later she heard it repeated back to her in contexts she hadn't anticipated, by people she'd never met, which she never quite knew what to make of. But the mill stood, and the ridge grew back between harvests, and the creek ran clean along the eastern boundary the way it had always run. And in the county records in Helena, a filing from 1897 sat beside a filing from 1908, and together they told the story of a piece of land that had been understood, threatened, defended, and kept, not because anyone had been particularly lucky, because someone had paid attention, and then someone else had. And then, in the way these things sometimes work when enough people are looking, the thing that had been built there did not disappear.